Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our conversation about disaster philanthropy. I'm Afi Tengue. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the VP of Philanthropy and Impact at Giving Compass. Joining me today is Regine Webster, the VP at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Welcome, Regine.
Hey, Afi.
Thanks for joining us. So, there's been a rather jarring uptick in disasters around the world. We are looking at wildfires, hurricanes, flooding, earthquakes, Afghanistan, Haitian migrants at the border, and all compounded by COVID. And given the most recent climate report, these events are likely to increase in frequency and severity over time. Today, we'll discuss strategies for donor engagement, the intersectionality of structural racism and the impacts of disasters, and what donors can do to support equitable restructuring efforts. Regine, before we start, can you please share a bit about yourself and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy?
Absolutely. So I've been working as a disaster grant maker since 2003, and so have seen disasters both here domestically as well as abroad, ranging from the Hurricane Katrina, the Darfur genocide, the South Asian tsunami, you name it. I've been privileged to be a grant maker to the event. I am based in Nashville, Tennessee, and am the Vice President of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. I joined the center as its founding executive director back in 2010. The vision for our organization was to be that 365-day-a-year resource for philanthropy, so that if you have a question, even today, about Hurricane Katrina recovery efforts, you can come to our website, call one of us, email one of us, and we'll come with a prompt and ready answer. What we knew long ago was that disasters make it sounds crass, but right, like they obtain a lot of media attention, but then they fall off the media really quickly. Yeah. And subsequently, the attention and financial resources to disasters also goes away. So our goal is really to be out there loud and proud, encouraging donors to look at the full arc of a disaster, all the way from things that can prevent and mitigate disasters through long-term recovery.
Yeah, and I think I'm looking forward to part of our conversation diving into, like, given the past 6 weeks have been one thing after another, how donors don't get exhausted and fatigued and continue to prioritize, long-term change that mitigates the chances of these things persisting in the future. Okay, first question. After a disaster, donors are often unsure who to give their donations to. Can you share some of your strategies for donors or criteria to consider when they're looking at organizations?
Yeah, and I took notes in advance of our call, so if it looks like I'm reading off of a piece of paper, it's because I'm reading off of a piece of paper.
Oh, we're here for that. We like preparation.
I just want to make sure I got my reading glasses on here. So first and foremost, like I just foreshadowed, we really encourage donors to keep their powder dry, right? So hold back a little bit. By the way, people that work in disasters, they are full up with bumper sticker little things like keep your powder dry. So bear with me as I pepper our conversation with that. So we know that 80% of all disaster donations arrive within the immediate months following an event. And I'm going to draw this is my bell chart, right? Everybody see my little bell curve here? We know that peak giving following a disaster is on day 4 after an event occurs. And it coincides 100% with the peak day of media giving. That day 4 is like this magic giving, magic media day. And then after that, there's this precipitous drop off of both funding and as well as attention. So we know, though, and you listening know, that recovery takes years. And so I would really like to encourage everyone listening to take the time to invest in that medium and long-term recovery. Take time to understand what those needs are as they emerge, right? Because the needs on day 4 are different than the needs on day 180. So take time to listen and learn and understand that. The second is to reach out, and this is like an easy one, right? Reach out to your existing grantee partners. They may have been affected by the disaster. They may be leading part of the disaster response or recovery. They may have intel on which organization is doing amazing work. So just, they can be incredibly helpful resources, both in terms of funding decisions and also supporting them directly in their efforts as it relates to a particular disaster. And you'd be surprised at how many of your grantee partners do get involved in disaster response and recovery organizations. Education, arts organizations, wraparound service organizations, they are all in the mix when it comes to disaster response and recovery.
Yeah, I definitely did AmeriCorps with the Red Cross very, very early. That was my very first job after undergrad. And the reality of going to disaster relief assignments, there was like this point, so it was probably 2003, where there were like 6 or 7 like hurricanes in Florida, one after another, after another, after another. And so we got on the ground, and it was just fascinating to see like everybody is chipping in, everybody is doing everything, and getting an idea of who is actually supporting those most disadvantaged, and on the ground information and up to date knowledge of like, this place is completely flooded. There are no beds here. And where can you actually prioritize is so important. And so I just love your perspective on like, talk to the people who are actually there. I think that's, it seems logical, but.
I mean, you know what, so my second bumper sticker that I'll offer for today is disasters begin and end local, right? And that builds upon exactly what you were just saying, is that, you know, the organizations that are first on the scene, and I don't mean in the sort of firefighter first on the scene, but providing care and support, those are the organizations that, you know, 2 years down the line are still going to be there doing the case management, supporting, getting people back in homes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay, next question. There are clearly several stages of giving, especially your bell curve was incredibly useful. I'm thinking about that immediate relief, that day 4, that is magical, that I had no idea existed, and it completely makes sense as well. Recovery, and then building long-term resilience. How should donors be thinking about these stages if they want to affect real change in communities over time in ways that are preemptive to what we're seeing?
So the first counsel that I'll offer, right? So like FEMA classifies disasters into 4 stages: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And I want to encourage anybody who's listening right now to think about those as a scaffolding upon which to understand disasters, but they're not rote, right? They're not like, okay, we've checked out of the preparedness stage and we are now in response, right? No. It's a framework upon which to understand disasters. So they are descriptive, but not prescriptive. As I said before, we very much encourage donors to fund medium and long-term recovery. We know that disasters are protracted. Again, I know I've said that, but they can take decades. And so that I really just want to hammer that home. So funding nonprofit organizations to do that long work of recovery, and again, that could be case management, that could be home rebuilds, that could be mental health services, ensuring safe access to clean water supply. Those efforts take months to years to make sure that they're done right. The second piece to my response here is to think about pre-existing vulnerabilities, right? So you've got your pre-existing vulnerabilities that exist in this both the natural environment as well as the built environment, right? Like you mentioned Florida, let's look at Florida, right? Florida has elements around built environment as well as the natural environment that predisposition it to hazards, right? Either because of climate change, rising water, receding coastline, et cetera, et cetera. And so one thing for funders to do is like, what can you do to keep people from harm's way, people or organizations from harm's way in that, where you're looking at those vulnerabilities. And that's, that could be understanding your levee system in New Orleans or other parts of Southwest Louisiana. Or it could be simple efforts to encourage preparedness among your existing grantees. So even if you're working with your local food bank and you're an existing donor to your local food bank, there's ways to connect with them to say, hey, like, do you have a continuity of operations plan for your organization so that you know the phone tree and the communications plan and who's going to run incident command? It could also mean working with that same food bank to say, hey, you have 100 staff. Do all of your 100 staff have the supplies that they need to be ready, in their basement? And a donor could help support that personal preparedness work as well. So I would love to see donors get involved both in that kind of, again, addressing pre-existing vulnerabilities as well as looking at that medium and long-term recovery.
Yeah, I definitely again, back to my time with the Red Cross, like we would show up to houses that had burned down and like renters insurance. And like, I think it did instill in me at the age of 19, like, you need a disaster kit, you need a go bag. Like, and I think as we watch these like scaffolding levels of disaster happen, more and more people like, maybe I should have like 3 gallons of water per person in my house, like that's potable when the water, like, so it's just, how do we get to a mindset of being prepared in general for what the climate report is telling us is coming? Like, how do we prepare for what we are absolutely positive is on its way? And doing that personally, like structurally and corporately, and then also for our nonprofits.
Yeah, and if you don't know, Ready.gov, right, which is a FEMA affiliated website, they like block it out for you. Here's what you need to have in your basement, Regine. Here's what you need to have, Effie, in your basement. And they also have partnered with Operation Hope, which is a nonprofit organization that I'm sure I'm butchering their mission statement, but they look at they look at sort of like personal financial resilience. And they have a toolkit, again, that's for you, that's for me, that's for my neighbor, that's for my neighbor that side, that gets your financial readiness, so that you've got written down and photocopies of your deeds and your insurance and where your bank accounts are. And so that's all part of personal preparedness. It's really critical.
Yeah, and I cannot say without like anything more important than like have an extra set of cell phone chargers that are in your go bag. Like I just like, it's one of those things, because people always like, I have my phone. I'm like, will your phone make it? And even if your phone does, how long will it be charged? Like at least have that available. And I think we used to teach like kindergarten through like 5th grade disaster preparedness. And it's like, have your parents write down your address and their phone numbers, because they aren't going to remember and they're not going to know. It's just going to, if they have one of the little kid phones or watches, it's just going to say mom. And so like, how do you actually prepare them in ways to like know how to like know your mom's full name? Like those things are things kids don't know. And so just really setting everybody up for the best possible outcome in the disasters we know are coming.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about climate change a couple of times, but let's continue to talk about it. We know that it plays a huge role in increasing frequency and severity of disasters. I think Hurricane Ida is a really good example of that. I will say like earthquakes is less about us as long as there's not fracking, but it's something we see that are becoming, and like the reality and long history of Haiti never recovering from the earthquakes from before. And again, that drop off, like there are very few philanthropists that stayed and are still there. And so they're back again. And what does it look like to support them long term? But in any case, like, can we talk about the intersection of climate philanthropy and disaster philanthropy? And I think that they are one and the same, but I'd love to get your actual official definition of what they look like.
You know, to me, you only have to look at California right now to see exactly what you're talking about playing itself out in real time, right? Like wildfires are burning out of control, burning massive amounts of land, right? Like we've all read the New York Times piece that talks about how goats are now being brought in to do brush management. We know that, federal dollars, state dollars are tapped out in terms of the pre-fires, like the prescribed burns. But every county in California is in a drought situation. So we've got fires, we've got drought. The IPCC report really brought home that temperatures are rising, and that with rising temperatures, you see rising sea level, you see increased fires. You're going to see wet places like here in Tennessee get wetter, and you're going to see dry places like California getting drier. So there's just no there's no debating anymore. What I would say about philanthropy is that the disaster folks have been over here doing their disaster thing. I'm sure that's a technical term. And the climate people and the environmental funders have been over here, attending to environmental needs. But what I'm seeing is that they are rapidly kind of coalescing to be one. To your point, they are, right? Like they are inextricably linked. And
that Venn diagram is like undeniable.
I know, right? You read my visual Venn diagram here.
I'm appreciating all the graphics with your fingers today. We've got a bell curve. We've got the Venn diagram. It's like a virtual whiteboard.
So sorry.
It's so good.
It's something. I don't know. Yeah. So, the other piece that we can say, and I know we're going to get to this more in depth as well, but like there are communities that are being particularly hard hit by climate, and in the United States, that particular community, right, it's communities of color that are being disproportionately affected by climate, and that is a fact.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive into the next question about structural racism. Like, because of it, communities of color are often disproportionately impacted by natural disasters, making it more difficult to rebound. And I have so many issues with the term rebound or recovery because it implies that where we were at before was enough, and like there was human dignity there. And so, as we think about something like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, you know, there's a real, very clear, visceral example of structural racism and how it's played out. How do we work toward equitable recovery, like and restructuring of society so that this doesn't keep happening and happening in worse ways for communities of color?
You know, so the single most determinant factor in recovery is race.
Well, that's the headline from the conversation. It's like, and we're done.
Right.
Thanks for coming.
And we're done.
Okay.
Right. I mean, that is it. But I'm going to say it again. The single most determinant factor in recovery is race. And that starts with redlining and gerrymandering and voter suppression and stats on homeownership and where communities of color live.
Mm-hmm.
I learned from my friend over at the NAACP that they have one of their pillars is dedicated exclusively to disasters and climate justice, because they have identified the nexus of race and economic status as being the biggest predictor of disasters, right? Can you in your head, Afi, see the benzene plant that leaked following Hurricane Harvey 2017? Do you remember that at all?
Yeah.
Anyway, right? Okay, right. It was not a wealthy community that lived right next to the benzene plant. It was a low-income community of color that lived there. And so what is it that we need to do when we're talking about, back to the previous question, when we're talking pre-existing vulnerabilities, like one of those is where people live.
Yeah.
And so that's something like that has to be addressed. So I will say a couple things on the do side of things. One is that FEMA just recently released a report identifying its own shortcomings in meeting the needs of communities of color, and they're working to address them. And I have colleagues who live down in New Orleans who have said they've seen efforts on behalf of FEMA to be more inclusive and to look at Ida recovery through an equity lens. And so, my fingers are crossed. My hope is high that they continue to execute against their own, or execute the recommendations stemming from their own report. Support for BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations needs to be top of mind for all of us who are in the funder space. We did a report with Candid last year. We actually did two. And it tracked, monitored, and analyzed COVID giving. And so the first report saw literal billions of dollars going to vaccine efforts, right? And then midpoint of last year, we have, huge protests, like racial injustice was, breaking our hearts across the nation. And then we saw, as part of that racial reckoning process, we saw an increase, not a huge increase, but an increase in donor giving to BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations around the topic of COVID-19. So we need more, of that for sure. And then, the last one is a funny one. People often don't think about legal services as affiliated with disasters. And why is Regine bringing this up in light of the question of race? When you support organizations that provide legal services to BIPOC communities, they then can help with things like land deeds to FEMA disbursements, and really assisting and unpacking any linkage between, losing land or missing out on a FEMA disbursement going to race.
Yeah, I think we underestimate legal services. So a few things. The way you frame this, talking about, so we talk about structural racism, like gerrymandering, voter suppression, just the reality of like a representative democracy would have people who are holding elected officials accountable about the sewage in their backyard, about the asthma levels in their community because of the air pollution. Like it's all deeply, it's wildly intentional and very quietly addressed. And so when we think about, even with the Haitian migrant crisis, like understanding like, what are your rights? Like you have a legal right to asylum. You should not be deported like while you're legally applying for asylum. And so like we as an actual field of philanthropy need to be much more intentional about the legal rights and an opportunity and access to BIPOC and BIPOC-led organizations and communities, because it's built into our systems. It's in every single line of the Constitution is built around continuing to oppress and suppress communities of color. And so I'm just glad that you highlighted the legal aspect of it, because there are so few entities doing it at large. And I can't think of a single entity doing in a broad way that is building coalition up and down ballot that we need to be thinking about really more intentionally. And elevating across whatever it is that we support in philanthropy. We should all be focused on the legal aspects of it. So I just appreciate you highlighting that. Okay, our last question. So this year, we've seen so many disasters, compounding disasters, earthquakes, Afghanistan, all against the backdrop of the pandemic. I think the visuals of Afghan refugees on giant cargo trucks all next to each other when you think about COVID and you're like 6 feet apart and they're all on top of each other with a backpack. It's chilling, right? So how should donors think about long-term giving when there's just an onslaught, one thing after another of multiple crises?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty loud right now, right? It's pretty loud. And I know that it's kind of physically challenging for philanthropy to stay on top of it too, right? There's a lot of grief and a lot of suffering right now. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm very clear that I'm in an air-conditioned house with a full fridge, and so I'm very clear with that. But that doesn't mean that I don't feel a sense of grief and the suffering that is happening worldwide. So I'm going to give you my third metaphor here, not my third metaphor, my third bumper sticker, which is stick to your knitting, right? All of the donors that might be listening to this, you have a mission, you have a focus. It might be the arts, it might be education, it might be the environment, it might be gardening for all I know. But every one of those, your mission is deeply important. So stick to your mission and continue. You can support disasters simultaneous in parallel with supporting your mission, right? Again, through the preparedness work that's mitigating pre-existing vulnerabilities, all the way through long-term recovery. Like, again, I'm not trying to make a funny here, but if you are looking at urban green spaces, let me tell you, urban green spaces are so necessary as a mitigative element of disasters to not. I'm going to say this. We saw donations to disaster events last year decrease, like by a lot, and that was in light of what was then a record-breaking California wildfire season, and it was the first time since 2005 that we looped into the Greek alphabet in terms of named hurricanes. I think that New Orleans and southern Louisiana was in the cone of uncertainty between 6 and 8 times last year. That's a lot of stress. So, and yet we saw very few donations to Laura or Eta or Iota, even with they were repeat disasters on the same communities, and we saw really few dollars. Meanwhile, we saw dollars like I've never ever seen in my entire career going toward the pandemic. So I'm very, very thankful for that. But we have to keep our eyes on what those disaster event needs are. Either refugee crises like we're seeing with Afghanistan, all the way through the wildfires and the hurricanes that are yet to come this year. So part of it is just staying vigilant and staying focused and staying dedicated to meeting the needs of people who are negatively affected by disasters.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I learned from one of our colleagues that I think it's concise as capital, but he's like, know your number. Like when you look at how much, what is your wealth? And then what percent of that are you giving away? Not your income, but your actual wealth. Like what percent are you giving away? And I think typically nationally, it's 1.82%. For us to really create change, we need to can I get you to 5? If we can get you to 5% of your actual wealth, knowing that those who were wealthy at the beginning of the pandemic are worldly, worlds away more wealthy than they were when they started. And knowing that the data shows that as wealth grows, people's gift sizes remain the same. How do you get really conscious, with your financial advisor around what is liquid and how you get to like being a leader at like 5% of giving away, so that we can create the structural long-term change that's like the boom and bust cycle of 4 days and then it goes away with media attention, is because there's no public voice, there's no organizing that's happening that is bringing it to public account, like at local, state, and then federal levels across the board. And so how can you support and resource that voice long term, and then also be really aware of what your giving looks like in regards to like the full understanding of how much money you have, is really deeply important.
And, just to riff off of that, in preparation for our conversation, I did, I scoured your all's website, and I kind of loved the way you described impact-driven philanthropy and thought that the 4 pillars of impact-driven philanthropy, equity, effectiveness, systems change, I have a list, sorry, and transparency. I thought that actually related really well to this conversation around disasters, and where donors can and should play a role to be most effective in their giving as it relates to disasters, right? Like, think about it. We've talked about the equity elements of disasters. We've talked about the effectiveness. We've talked about the need for systems change. Maybe we haven't touched so much on transparency, but actually I think your last comment, Effie, completely did, of like, let's just continue to have the voice out there of what the needs are, what's happening, and just keep elevating it and making what's known aware.
Yeah, and I think like the transparency for me is about accountability to communities, versus like nonprofits being accountable to you because you gave them money that was built upon. So like for me, like, transparency is like, it's really like how are you being accountable to communities, like, and not the boom and bust cycle of even starting a nonprofit and giving them millions of dollars and then like completely abandoning it, which happens all the time in philanthropy with like a strategic refresh mid-year. Like, how do you show up accountable to people that you're trying to, it's true. We both know it's true. We do. How do you show up accountable to the people who are still there, because they're still there, and show up accountable to humanity. Like, you have been given a gift and you should be a steward of those resources, particularly given our tax structures. So like, given like the breaks that you've been given on these roads that are built with tax dollars that you may not pay, like, how do you show up as a steward of those resources for humanity, right? And do more than the 2%. In any case, we're just about out of time. Is there anything else you want people to know before we wrap this up?
No, this has been really great to talk to you. I'm thankful for you listening to my bumper sticker moments, and just thankful that we're continuing the conversation.
Yeah, you're one of my new favorite people. I'm glad we got to have this conversation today.
Back at you. Back.
All right, so we're just about out of time. Thank you, Regine, yet again for talking with me today. For those of you who want to learn more about the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, you can visit disasterphilanthropy.org for more donor resources and disaster issue funds, which we curate here in rapid response to everything as it unfurls. It's been a lot of work the past 6 weeks. Please visit givingcompass.org. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day. Bye.